This is Captain Paul Jones. I'm going to talk about understanding apparent versus true wind for beginning sailors. This is my cell phone and my email if you need to get a hold of me or have any questions. I started sailing in 1980 on scores of boats from 14 to 50 feet. Formed and ran a charter sailing operation on a 40-foot cruising catamaran in Florida. Done many coastal cruises from Virginia to Texas, and spent extensive time on all three coasts of Florida. Done several offshore passages, and I am a U.S. Coast Guard captain, licensed captain. I spent a whole year living aboard an Island Packet 45 monohull sailboat. We sailed, my family and I sailed from from Florida to Trinidad, and then back all the way up to Virginia, visiting most of the islands of the Caribbean. And I wrote a book about it that is available on Amazon. So this old poster illustrates this young lady is having the time of her life. She's either got sailing all figured out or doesn't really seem to worry too much about it. Whereas the guy at the tiller is freaking out. He doesn't quite know what he's doing. If he had a better understanding of apparent versus true wind, he might be able to also relax and enjoy the ride. So I'm going to talk about various things, how we perceive wind, define true, induced, and apparent wind, talk about why you need to worry about both the wind speed, apparent wind speed and direction at the various points of sail, talk a little bit about vectors, and then discuss the apparent versus true wind angles, apparent versus true wind speed, and again, how that affects the boat on the various points of sail, and then kind of summarize what I talked about. So we can't really see the wind, but we can see its effects. You can observe it visually. The height and direction of the waves will tell you the speed and direction of the wind. Flags fluttering, birds tend to fly into the wind, anchored boats point into the wind. Eventually, the more you sail, you will learn to able to sort of feel the speed and direction of the wind on your skin. You can use telltales. These are bits of yarn that are tied to the side stays, or a Windex at top of the mast that shows the direction of the wind. This is the direction of the apparent wind. Electronic instruments also will show the direction and the speed. So let's talk about definitions. True wind is the wind, both speed and direction, that you would feel or measure if you were on an anchored boat that wasn't moving through the water or over the ground. Once the boat starts to move through the air, it will induce wind by its motion or movement through the air. So depending on the angle to the true wind, you will feel a wind that's different from the true wind, and that's called the apparent wind. And it's a combination of the induced wind created by the movement of the boat through the air and by the true wind. So these are the Windexes and telltales I talked about. They show the apparent wind. So again, that's the direction the wind feels like it's moving relative to the boat. The arrow on the Windex points to the direction the wind is blowing from. So in this case, the arrows are always pointed to the stern of the boat. I'm sorry, the V's with the boxes at the ends are always pointed towards the stern. So the wind is coming from behind the boat in this illustration. Whereas in this illustration, the wind is coming from the front of the boat. And you'll soon learn that when you're sailing upwind, you need to keep the tail of the arrow outside this V. Otherwise, you're going to be in irons and sailing in the no-go zone. So larger, more modern boats use electronic wind instruments to show both the speed and the direction, and they can calculate the true wind speed and direction. So in this instance, if you press on this button, it'll toggle between the true wind and the apparent wind. And when you press it, this little square will move over here. In this instance, the true wind is blowing at 60 degrees from the bow of the boat at 24.3 knots. But it's important to remember through all this, you need to understand the true wind, but you can only set your sails to the apparent wind. And that's the easiest for you to visualize and to measure with telltales and Windexes. So why should you worry about the apparent wind angle? Since the wind is the engine that drives the boat, the direction the wind is blowing from relative to the bow of the boat, or that angle will determine the angle that you're going to set your sails for maximum force and for maximum speed. Why worry about the wind speed? Well, it's important to know that as the speed of the wind doubles, the force created by the wind on the same sail area is squared. So it's important to determine the wind speed, the apparent wind speed, to determine the sail area that you have up and when it's time to reef or reduce the amount of sail area you're flying. So let's look at the points of sail. You've seen this diagram before, I assume, but this is the no sail zone. If you're motoring directly into the wind, the sails flutter and flap. And there's an angle of about 90 degrees to the true wind angle that you can't sail. As you fall off onto what is close hauled, you'll find that you can sail about 45 degrees to the true wind. But and then as you fall off on a reach, both close and beam and broad, you'll notice that the angle of the sails are let out more and more, and then on a true run directly downwind, they're let out even further. But again, this illustrates the angle to the true wind, but you're only going to be able to feel or easily determine the apparent wind, and that's why we need to figure out the difference between the two. So one of the ways to do that is use vectors. The math behind these is a little bit beyond me and this discussion. But if you think of vectors as arrows, their length is relative to the speed and their angle is relative to the direction of the wind. So if you use a compass rose, you would say that when the boat is moving through the water, the induced wind can be X. Let's say this is 5 knots from the northwest, and the true wind is 8 knots from the southwest. But if you do the math, X plus Y is the apparent wind, and this is the wind that you perceive. So it's going to feel like you've got 13 knots from the west when you're sailing at this angle. And the same way with the angle, you can measure the apparent wind angle by the Windex, and you can use math to calculate the true wind angle. So again, you're moving this way, you're sailing upwind. The boat is moving this way, induces wind that way. It's going to feel like the wind is coming from this angle to the bow of the boat, but the true wind is actually further aft. So again, the boat is moving this direction at that speed. This is the apparent wind angle that you can perceive and see with the Windex, but the true wind angle is different. Why is this? Because so wind has both speed and direction, and the apparent wind is affected by the speed and direction of the boat's movement and the speed and direction of the true wind. So the apparent wind angle is defined as the angle between the apparent wind and the bow of the boat. It's the direction that the wind feels like it's coming from, and it's affected by both the boat's speed and direction of travel and the speed and direction of the true wind. So the true wind angle is greater than the apparent wind angle when you're sailing upwind on a beat. And when you're sailing off the wind on a broad reach, the true wind angle is less than the apparent wind angle. So when sailing directly upwind or directly downwind or on a beam reach, the true and apparent wind angles are about equal. So let's look at our point of sail diagram. When you're in irons motoring directly into the wind, the true and apparent wind angles are equal at zero. They're zero relative to the center line of the boat. Once you fall off and become close hauled, you'll find that the apparent wind angle is about 30 to 35 degrees, 10 to 15 degrees different from the true wind angle. So it's going to seem like you're sailing closer to the wind than you actually are. Then as you continue to fall off on a beam reach, you'll find that both the true and apparent wind are about the same, 90 degrees. As you continue to fall off on a broad reach, it switches and the apparent wind angle is greater than the true wind angle, unlike when you were sailing upwind. And then when you're going directly downwind, the angle of the true wind and the induced boat wind are the same, 180 degrees. So you can only sail to the apparent wind. Although you can calculate the true wind, you're going to set your sails to the apparent wind. The wind angle, again, when beating, heading upwind as close hauled as you can get, feels like it's about 30 to 35 degrees off the bow of the boat. And that's what the Windex is going to tell you. But when you go to tack, you think, well, I can tack through 60 to 70 degrees. But in reality, you're only going to be able to tack through 90 degrees because the apparent wind angle when heading upwind is less than the true wind angle by about 15 degrees. So here we are. You notice when you look up, the angle on the V of the Windex is not 90 degrees. It's about 75 degrees. So when you're sailing close hauled, it appears that you're sailing within 30 or 35 degrees of the wind, but that's the apparent wind, not the true wind. And so when you tack, you need to find a point that's 90 degrees off the side of the boat, because that's where you're going to be headed when you tack 90 degrees into the wind. So again, your boat, you're going along this way. It appears that the apparent wind is here. It's this blue arrow, and it's closer to the bow of the boat than the true wind is. So when you tack over from a port tack to a starboard tack, again, the apparent wind seems like it's coming closer to the bow of the boat than the true wind, but you can only tack through 90 degrees, not 75. So the same thing happens with the apparent wind speed. When you're motoring directly into the wind, the boat's speed will be added to the true wind speed, and so to calculate the apparent wind speed. Think of it, if you're riding a bicycle at 10 miles an hour into a 10-mile-an-hour wind and you have a wind gauge on your handlebar, it's going to say, well, the apparent wind is 20 miles an hour, although the true wind is 10. Turn around and go downwind, 10-mile-an-hour wind at your back, bicycling at 10 miles an hour, you're going to subtract your bicycle speed from the true wind speed. So it's going to feel like it's zero. You have no wind. So, and when you go on the various other points of sail, again, going directly into the wind, the true and the apparent wind speed and angles are the true wind angle is the same. The speed, the boat speed is different. So when you fall off on a close hauled, which is B here, the apparent wind will be angled closer to the center line of the boat than the true wind, and the length of this arrow is longer. So the apparent wind will be feel like the wind is blowing harder than it is and closer to the bow of the boat. On a reach, they're about equal. The true and apparent wind speeds are approximately equal. And then when you fall off on a broad reach, you'll find that the wind appears to go down. So when you're sailing downwind, you'll say, hey, what happened to all our wind? Well, it's because you're subtracting a portion of the boat's speed from the true wind to get the apparent wind speed. and the angle is changed. So when the wind picks up and the boat is overpowered, you're beating, you can simply turn downwind, and that will decrease the apparent wind speed and therefore the force on the sails. So if the wind picks up and you're getting hammered, you can, assuming you have sea room, you can turn downwind and take the force of the wind off the sails. And the faster the boat sails, that's going to affect the apparent wind, both speed and angle. So if the true wind is 10 knots from the west and you're going 2, 5, and 7 knots straight north, then the apparent wind angle is going to the apparent wind speed will increase and the angle will decrease. So in summary, a boat moving through the air will create or induce wind, and when combined with the true wind, that is called the apparent wind. It's the angle of the bow of the boat to the apparent wind. The wind speed felt or measured is on the boat is the apparent wind speed, and you can use vectors to either calculate or visualize both the true wind speed and true direction. But it's important to remember that you can only trim your sails to the apparent wind, and that's fortunate because that's what you can visualize with Windexes, with telltales on your stays, or with electronic instruments. So when you're sailing on a beat, upwind, close hauled, again, the apparent wind speed will be greater than the true wind, and the apparent wind angle will be less than the true wind angle. So you're going to use that when you tack. So you're going to plan on tacking through 90 degrees to the true wind, not the 75 degrees to the apparent wind. When sailing off the wind on a broad breach or a downwind on a run, the apparent wind speed decreases, and it is less than the true wind speed, although the apparent wind angle will be greater than the true wind angle. So again, if the wind picks up overpowering the boat, you can fall off on a broad breach or a run if a squall moves through. So this is my, again, my cell phone and my email. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.